If you've given Zero Parades for Dead Spies a chance, you've likely realized the game has more depth than it initially appears. Gradually, it demands more attention, more patience, and above all, better decision making. As I played, testing various approaches and making plenty of mistakes in the process, I noticed several details that significantly aid gameplay, things that aren't immediately obvious. So in this video, I'm going to share 10 advanced tips that can make your life in the game much easier and help you get more out of every mission. I'm Matthew, and the video is about to begin. One of the most tempting mechanics is the one that can destroy you if used without thought, forcing the dice. Unlike other isometric RPGs where you simply accept the result and move on, the game provides a false sense of control here. You can pull an extra die at critical moments, and it is powerful. But it's not a win button, it's almost a pact. I say this because in practice, you feel the weight of this choice very quickly. The exertion system gives you an immediate advantage. Rolling 3 dice and keeping the best 2 seems great, but the price comes in the form of anxiety, fatigue, or even delirium. And it's not the type of penalty you can just ignore later. It accumulates, corrodes your future decisions, and before you know it, your character is operating at their limit. Therefore, the mindset here must change. You don't use this to optimize a single play. You use it to survive decisive moments. That conversation that defines an entire line of investigation, a check that could mean life or death, or even a situation where failing closes an important narrative door. These are the moments when it is worth paying the price, not before. If you start using this as a crutch, the game punishes you in a silent yet constant way. Zero Parades is much more about emotional control and risk management than about winning rolls. Knowing how to hold back that temptation is what separates a solid run from an inevitable collapse. And honestly, that is what makes this system so interesting. If there is one thing in Zero Parades for Dead Spies that completely changes how you play, it's this mental conditioning system, the so-called thought cabinet. And honestly, this isn't just an inventory substitute, it's practically the heart of the game. At first, it seems like just another passive bonus system, but when you truly start testing it, you can see it goes far beyond that. The most interesting part is how these thoughts, like the unrealized loss, aren't just stuck on numbers or stats, they literally alter the game's rules. It's the kind of mechanic that forces you to think differently, rather than just optimizing a build. Depending on what you choose to internalize, the world reacts differently, dialogues change, and you begin to access paths that simply don't exist for other types of characters. Here is the more advanced part of the tip. You need to start thinking of these thoughts as your main build, not a complement. Certain conditionings practically redefine your entire approach, whether for social manipulation, infiltration, or even psychological reading of NPCs. This creates an absurd layer of replayability, because it isn't just playing again, it is literally living another version of that spy. To me, the coolest part is that this feels like a direct evolution of the Disco Elysium thought cabinet, only much bolder. Here, the game isn't afraid to let you break patterns and experiment with strange things. So if you want to get the most out of it, don't play it safe. Choose thoughts that seem weird or risky, because in this game, being an unconventional spy isn't just style, it's a real advantage. There is a choice in the prologue of Zero Parades for Dead Spies that seems completely idiotic at first glance, but can define the tone of your early game, rubbing the pseudopod's bald head for luck. And yes, I know how that sounds, but trust me, it's more strategic than it looks. This small, absurd moment grants you the feeling lucky status, which helps significantly with early checks exactly when you are still adapting to the system. And those opening minutes are more important than they seem. That's when you are understanding how the game responds to your choices, how the checks function, and most importantly, how to avoid silly mistakes that can set you back. Having this bonus active makes this phase much smoother, almost as if the game gives you a larger margin for error while you are still finding your rhythm. But of course, Zero Parades doesn't give you anything for free. The detail many people ignore is that you leave your fingerprints at the crime scene, and that isn't just a cosmetic detail. The game remembers it. Depending on how your investigation unfolds, this small decision can come back to haunt you in a very inconvenient way. So the classic game logic applies. Do you want a more comfortable start, or do you prefer to play clean from the beginning? In my experience, it's worth taking feeling lucky, especially if you are still learning. But it's good to enter the game with that mindset. Here, even an apparently silly gesture can become a real consequence down the line. If there is one silent trap, it is the so-called dramatic encounters. At first, they appear to be just more intense moments of dialogue or decision-making, but in practice, they are tactical sequences disguised as narrative. And that is exactly where many people go wrong. They try to solve everything the same way, always relying on the same skill as if it were a safe button. However, the game doesn't work like that. It doesn't warn you directly, but it begins to punish those who repeat the same approach. Using the same skill twice in a row during an encounter will gradually increase the difficulty of the checks invisibly. And this is brilliant, because it forces you to step off autopilot and actually interpret the situation as a spy would, adapting at all times. The right way to play these moments is to treat every choice as part of a strategic flow. Alternating between action, relation, and intellect isn't just aesthetic variety. It's a real advantage. Sometimes you start by imposing presence, then shift to social reading, and finish with logic or analysis. This alternation creates a rhythm that keeps your chances high, even when the narrative pressure is high. To me, that is where the game truly shines. Because it's not about having the best build, but about knowing how to conduct the scene. When you understand this, dramatic encounters cease to be obstacles and become opportunities to show total mastery of the system. And the more you mix your approaches, the more the game seems to open a path for you, as if acknowledging that you are playing at the level it expects. Clicking through the most direct options just to advance the mission quickly is practically asking to miss important content. And that is not an exaggeration. Here, every dialogue can open a new possibility later on, or completely close a route without you even realizing it. Characters like Goat Eyes are the best example of this. At first glance, he might seem like just another secondary contact, someone there to provide context. But if you exhaust the dialogue options, you start to notice small clues, nuances, and even hooks that will make a difference hours later. The game heavily rewards those who have the patience to listen, question, and explore everything. The problem is that if you cut this process short, there is no going back. Zero Parades follows that very classic, heavy narrative RPG philosophy. Choices are permanent. That line of dialogue you ignored could mean a completely different approach in a future mission, or its total absence. And the game doesn't warn you when you've just missed something important. So the tip here is simple, but completely changes your experience. Treat every conversation as an investigation in itself. Dig deep, test options, and revisit characters whenever possible. Because in this game, information is power, and losing it out of haste is one of the quietest ways to sabotage your own run. One of the easiest things to miss in Zero Parades for Dead Spies is precisely what can save your run later on: the fogged mirror. This bar isn't just a recurring setting, it functions as a true narrative safety net. You know when you fail to recruit someone or simply let that moment to confirm a character's loyalty pass? Well, the game doesn't punish you definitively for that. It gives you a second chance, but you need to know where to look. And that is where the fogged mirror comes in. I began to notice it functions almost like a rendezvous point for everything left unfinished. Characters you think you lost might reappear there, conversations can be resumed, and decisions that seemed closed gain a new opening. It isn't spelled out, so many people simply ignore it and move on, thinking it's done. The smartest use of this is to treat the bar as part of your strategy, not just as an optional location. Before important moments, especially near the final mission, it is very worthwhile to stop by and review your connections. Sometimes a small detail or one extra conversation ensures an essential member for your team. And in a game where each character can completely change the course of the mission, this carries a lot of weight. This makes the game much more interesting because it reduces the frustration of permanent errors without removing the weight of choices. You still need to chase things down. You still need to engage with the characters. The fogged mirror doesn't fix your mistakes automatically. It only opens the door. Entering and fixing things still depends entirely on you. If you go in with the mindset that you need to pass every test, you will end up playing against the game's own design. Here, failing isn't a problem. Often, it is exactly what the game wants to happen. I felt this clearly when I started letting tests roll without trying to control everything. Some of the most memorable situations simply were born from ridiculous failures. A dialogue that goes completely out of control, an approach that goes wrong and forces you to improvise, and suddenly you are on a narrative path much more interesting than what a perfect success would have given you. This happens because the game doesn't treat error as a block, but as a detour. The developer built these failures as an active part of the narrative, with consequences that can be strange, uncomfortable, and even politically charged. Instead of stopping you, the game pushes you into new possibilities, sometimes more chaotic, but also richer. So instead of trying to be the perfect spy, make space to be the spy who adapts. Let the error happen and see where it takes you. Because in Zero Parades, often it is precisely when everything goes wrong that the game begins to get truly interesting. If there is one mechanic you cannot underestimate, it is your agent's mental control. Fatigue, anxiety, and delirium aren't there just to set the mood. They define how far you can go before you start self-sabotaging. And what's most interesting is that the game doesn't warn you when you are near the limit. It simply lets the consequences happen. During the tensest missions, these 3 meters rise almost without you noticing. You are focused on making the right decision, choosing the ideal dialogue, and suddenly your agent is on the verge of a breakdown. The worst mistake here is ignoring this, thinking you can tank it until the end of the scene. You can't. The game begins to distort your chances, scramble your responses, and in some cases, even change the character's behavior. The tip here is to treat fatigue, anxiety, and delirium as a constant priority, not as something secondary. Before entering any heavy sequence, look at these levels and ask yourself if it's really worth continuing in that state. Because if any of them breaks, the impact can be permanent, and that completely changes the direction of your campaign. This is what makes the game so unique. It doesn't just want to test your strategy, it wants to test your emotional control within the system. When you begin to respect these limits and play in a more calculated way, the experience changes entirely. You stop acting on impulse and start thinking like a real agent, someone who knows that maintaining sanity is just as important as completing the mission. This mechanic is, without exaggeration, one of the tensest. At critical moments, the game gives you the option to go beyond the limit, to exhaust yourself to gain an extra die with advantage. In practice, it is like betting Herschel's own life in exchange for a higher chance of success. And the most dangerous part is that in the moment of desperation, this always seems like the right choice. But the price comes heavy. Every time you force this exertion, some pressure meter rises, be it physical, mental, or something more unstable. And this isn't just an interface detail. These accumulations begin to affect how you play directly, limiting your options and pushing you into situations that are increasingly difficult to control. What is interesting is that the game doesn't stop you from using this multiple times. On the contrary, it provokes you. Critical situations appear in sequence, and you start to think just one more time. And that is exactly where many runs start to crumble. Because the system is designed to make you comfortable taking bad decisions in the short term. So using exertion well isn't about maximizing success. It's about knowing when to accept the real risk of collapse. In my experience, the best moments to use it are those where failing would completely change the course of the mission. Other than that, holding back this impulse is what keeps Herschel alive. Here, more than winning tests, the game is testing you the whole time. There are 15 attributes in total, divided between action, relation, and intellect. And each one functions as an internal voice, commenting, judging, and even arguing among themselves. And the more you pay attention to this, the more the game opens up. At first, it is easy to ignore and treat it as a traditional RPG system. But when you start to listen to these attributes, everything changes. They give clues, raise suspicions, and suggest paths that don't appear in the obvious options. In an interrogation, for example, it might be precisely this internal voice that reveals a contradiction or pushes you toward a more aggressive or subtle approach. The most interesting thing is that they don't always agree. Sometimes one attribute encourages you to trust someone, while another raises an alert. And that is where interpretation comes in. You aren't just choosing a dialogue option, you are deciding who to believe within Cascade's own mind. This adds a very strong psychological layer to the game. Don't treat these attributes as passive bonuses. Consult them all the time, read carefully what they are saying, and use it to your advantage. Because in Zero Parades, Understanding the protagonist's own mind is just as important as understanding the mission. And often, the best answer isn't on the screen, it's in the conflict between these voices.